How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to How to Build a Shed slash Playhouse Part 7. Today we're going to be concentrating on installing the door, the trim that goes around the entry door, as well as some additional trim that we're putting around the window. So I hope you guys enjoy, and thanks for watching. Alright, so we chose to go with a 36-inch by 80-inch right-hand in-swing door, and the reason we're doing that is obviously you want the door to go inwards unless you decide that you want a door to go outwards for some reason, but the door that we chose is going inward, and we want it to open up to the right. That way it does not affect the window even when the door is open, because our window is on the left side of our shed. So the very first thing that you want to do is take off all the plastic that's covering the corners of the door, just protecting the corners. Just remove all the plastic pieces that are around it that are going to affect any way for this to go in level. This job is always easier with two people. It could be done with one person, but it's always easier with two people. One person placing the door in, the other one leveling it off, and one person just holding the door to make sure it doesn't go uneven again. Again, this job could be done with just one person, but it makes it a lot easier with two. Now, when purchasing a door, you got to remember which one you're actually going to get. So you can get a door that doesn't have any framing around it, and you could build your own. You could have one that we purchased here that doesn't have any trim around it, and then you could purchase the one that actually has trim, that once you place it in, it flushes right against whatever the outside structure it is that you're working with, and you don't have to worry about making any trim. So the one that we purchased here obviously doesn't have any trim around it. We will make our own trim. It saves you money if you just do it yourself. Once you have the door in place, just kind of get a general idea of flushing this door up to the actual sheathing that you put on the outside, whether it be plywood or the true wood that we used here. Just get an idea of what it's going to look like being flushed against. That's your primary goal, is getting it flushed to the outside, not the inside. Once you have it somewhat flushed, get a piece of trim and just kind of see what it's going to look like when you put the trim over, to make sure that there's no gaps or bulges or anything that's going to be uneven. And by gaps, I know that there's going to be gaps between the door frame and the actual, studs or the actual sheathing that you put on the outside. The gaps, I mean, is between the actual trim that you're placing in and the door and the sheathing. So the tools that we'll be using for this portion is a level, a drill, some screws, and some shims. Just make sure that you purchase enough shims for this job. Shims are extremely cheap. Just make sure that you purchase enough, at least 2 packs, just to be able to work with. You don't want to have to go back to the store if you have 1 gap or 2 gaps that need to be filled and you ran out of shims. So just make sure that you purchase enough, and you can always keep those for additional jobs in the future. So the first thing that you want to do is start leveling this door off, and have another person pushing some shims into some corners of the doors just to get everything nice and even. And once you have those shims in, we're going to go ahead and start screwing those in to the studs that are on the inside of the shed. So you'll see how we do this here. There's different ways to do this, but our way right here is pretty simple, and it gets done in no time. So again, somebody leveling, and the other person is going to be placing the shims into the corners, or any gaps that you have that is going to helps pretty much just steady the door, so that when you place it in and you screw it in, it's not going to move at all. And just keep in mind that you're leveling off every single edge, top, sides, all that stuff. So the level portion right here is not so much finding it being leveled, it's making sure that it's flushed against the actual sheathing. Once you have your shims pretty much in place to where you want them, just go ahead and start finding some gaps that are between the actual framing of the door and the studs that are on the inside of the shed. And you're not placing these in to make any more additional leveling of the door. You're just filling in some gaps so that when you actually screw in, it's going to have a tighter hold on the door from the inside. So again, find all your gaps that you have and whatever a shim can fit in there, but you're not you're not going full force with the shims that you're actually finding the gaps with. Not like when you were putting the door on level, you're actually just filling the gaps in now. Even though we already had our shims placed, they were all in place already to make the door level. We want to make sure that with the new shims that we're putting in to fill in the gaps, that somebody didn't, accidentally push it in too hard, throw the door off. Because remember, these things are not screwed in yet. So screwing in the shims is the last portion of the entire project with the door when it comes to actually leveling it off. So keep in mind that you want to keep checking over and over again to make sure that nothing moved the door or unevened it, unleveled it, whatever you want to call it. Just make sure that whatever you're doing, every single thing that you do to this door, that you keep checking to make sure that it's leveled and flushed. And your last step before screwing this in is just checking one more time to make sure that everything is leveled. Put the level against the frame of the door to make sure that it's not uneven. And then from your sides, you want to use about a 4-foot level for this to be able to make sure that the door frame is flushed with the actual true wood that you're putting on, or whatever exterior sheathing that you placed on there. You want to make sure that it is actually flushed, and using a level is what's going to help you determine that. Alright, now time to start screwing the screws into the actual shims. You're going to want to go in from the inside of the frame, obviously, and screw into the shims that you placed in there. Hopefully nothing moves on you. And continue going around your frame, making sure that if there's any gaps that are needed to be filled, just go ahead and start placing some more shims around there. Just take a look around your door. This is the last time you're going to have this chance unless you remove the trim again to fix it. But if you do it right the first time, you're not going to have to remove the trim in order to do this again. So just placing all your shims to where you can, fill in some gaps, and go ahead and start screwing those in. So one thing that you can do in the end result to make this look completely finished is we are using some exterior deck screws here to screw the door into the actual shims. The head of the screw is going to leave a hole in your frame. If you are very specific about doing this the right way, you could fill it in with wood putty. And of course, just check your door once you have all the shims screwed in. Just check your door to make sure it opens and closes nicely, that there's no tight joints on this thing that's holding the door from opening or closing. So when purchasing the door, make sure that you have all the material attached to it. The bag that it came with either had 3 or 4 screws. I know 3 at the minimum, but it might have had a 4th screw just in case, you stripped a screw or whatever. But you're going to have, in all your hinges, you're going to have one open hole for you to screw in. So make sure that you have that material attached to your door. It matches the door hinges themselves. And what you want to do at this point is you want to make sure that the whole entire frame gets screwed in evenly. Just remember that. So when you're screwing the hinges into the actual studs themselves as well, you want to make sure that if there is a gap, that you're filling that in with a shim. So this portion of placing the shims in is not leveling the door. It's filling the gaps that are between the hinges, the frame, and the stud themselves. So again, you're not going full force with these hinges, with the shims going behind the hinges. You want to just make sure that you're covering the gap so that when you screw into that hinge, it's not going to bow or bend that frame. So just have that extra gap filled in there as a wedge, with the shim. Once you have those shims in place, go ahead and use those screws that were provided to screw into the hinge, into the shim, and into the actual stud. Don't forget to keep checking your door to make sure it's working properly. So one thing I wanted to mention also is purchasing the correct threshold on your door. The threshold I purchased here is extended just based on the fact that I know that I'm going to be building a deck on this shed when I turn it into an actual playhouse. I want to have a deck for the boys to have, for the chairs and stuff like that, for them to walk into the actual structure with ease. I want to make sure that when I'm building my deck, obviously you build it with a ledger board. So I want to make sure that my ledger board, whatever size I get, is going to fit snug with that threshold. If you are not going to build any sort of deck or any exterior portions outside of this structure, make sure that you purchase one with a threshold that is smaller, flushed up with that actual frame. Once you have all your shims screwed in, just use a razor blade and cut them. They're going to cut with ease with just a razor blade on the edges. Just make sure that it's actually flushed and you don't have any bulges, so it's going to affect any sort of trim or anything like that. Now putting the doorknob in with the deadbolt, make sure that you purchase a pack that actually has a knob and a deadbolt. If you're using a door that has 2 holes, just make sure that you purchase the correct set. This one that we're using is just the quick set. It doesn't run any more than $20 for the actual pack, and we are going to go ahead and install this one. Just follow your manufacturer's instructions on how to install your doorknobs. These are very easy to install. Just follow the instructions and you should have no issues with that. So while my dad here is placing the doorknobs and the deadbolt on this door, I'm going to go ahead and start on the actual trim on the outside portion of this door. And I'll show you just how easy it is to do this. So again, you could purchase a door that has the trim, so when you place it in, it's going to be nice and flushed. But again, I'm going to show you this way too. That's going to save you money, just to be able to spend a couple dollars on some pieces of wood, paint them, and cut them. So after the deadbolt and the knob are installed, just make sure that the keys that are provided with them work for the actual locks. They have, I believe they provide 2. One just in case you lose one, and you always have an extra one just in case. But just make sure they work with it before you actually say, okay, that's it. Alright, placing the trim against the actual door itself. It is very easy. I am using the same material, the 1x here, that I used for the corners of the shed. So, I painted these already, everything's dried up. All I'm doing here is leveling the bottom of that actual trim with the bottom of the shed to make sure that everything's even. Then you're going to move up to the top. I'm going to show you what the top looks like in a second. But the top corner portion, you want to make sure that you're marking right where that 45-degree corner is of that door. Let's move in a closer look so you can see. Make sure you purchase a piece of trim that's wide enough to cover the frame and the actual sheathing itself. So you can see the corner mark I have here right at the corner of the door. You're just going to transfer that to the front portion, the flat portion of your trim. Once you have that measurement transferred to the front, the flat portion of the trim, you're going to move it over to the miter saw. I'm going to show you how to cut this. Just remember that you're going to be doing this for both sides of the door. So pay attention to which way the blade is actually going to be cutting this wood. Move it over to 45 degrees, and that's going to be your cut. The angle portion of your speed square is set at 45 degrees. I like to make my line using that. That way I can see the entire line when I'm making my entire cut. Very important to remember this. You are not cutting on the line. You're not cutting below the line. You're actually cutting above the line so that you have that exact measurement cut out. You don't want to cut on that line, otherwise you're going to be short. And as you can see here, the bottom portion of the trim is flushed with the bottom portion of that true wood, and the very top is going to be flushed with that corner of the door. And that's exactly what you want when making this trim. Once you have the trim cut out, both sides, or one at a time, however you want to do it, just go ahead and put a level up to it to make sure that it is leveled. And I'm just going to use a finished nail gun here, and I'm going to tack this in with the finished nail gun. And I'm going to put a good amount of nails into this thing. I'm not overloading it, but I want to make sure that this trim is going nowhere. So I'm going to place a good amount of nails on this thing. The good thing about finished nails is that it leaves nearly no marking on your trim, and that's why you want to make sure you're using, thin nails, which the finish gun obviously gives you that ability. And you have your first piece up. Now it's time to work on the opposite side. Once you have your second piece tacked in there, you're going to go ahead and work on the top piece. Now, the little trick to doing this is basically turning this thing upside down from whichever way you're going to want to put it into. Once you have it upside down, mark where the top corners are at on both sides of your siding trim. So once you have those marked out, make your 45-degree measurements on that, cut it out, and then flip it the right side up, and then you're going to be able to push it right in. And as you can see here, both sides of the top trim are cut out at 45 degrees. If it worked with the little trick we did, it should fit flushed in there. And it does. It's always nice to use little tricks rather than having to measure everything. If you could just do it real quick like this was just shown, it makes the job a lot easier. And there's a little butterfly. Just go ahead and nail this portion in. Alright, as I explained earlier, the second portion was just tacked in to make sure that everything does fit perfect. Once you have everything up, just go ahead and start nailing it in with the finished nail gun. Just make sure that you're giving yourself a good amount of nails. You're not overkilling this thing, but you're giving yourself a good amount so that it does not move on you and it's very hard to rip off, if anything. Other than that, there's not much more to it. Just make sure you're nailing this in and everything fits tight. And I have one of my boys here enjoying the beginning portions of his new playhouse. I would say, judging by that face, he's pretty excited to have it. Alright, so getting back to the actual trim itself, just make sure that when you're nailing this portion in, that you are also hitting the sides to hit the corners, just like I'm doing right here. And if you do it this way, you're going to have some tight miter joints. Yeah, there are other ways to do it, but this is a very simple way and you're going to have a good clean finish. Moving over to my actual work shed, I'm going to go ahead and bring out the table saw. And the reason being is I purchased all the same exact material, and I'm going to go ahead and make some more additional trim to the window frame itself. So I didn't want to purchase a small piece of wood that's going to cost more than the bigger piece of wood when I can just strip these into pieces. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I already painted the actual piece that I'm going to put around the window, but once I strip it, you're going to hit raw wood again, so you're going to want to make sure that you paint that edging again, whichever portion that you actually stripped. And yes, I know that I need to build a slab of concrete out here to make this a little bit easier to run the table saw in and out of, which will be in the near future. And all I'm doing is getting my table saw set up. I love this extra, stand in the back side of it that I'm using right here to support. It raises it up and down to whatever level you need it to be at. If you're using a table saw on a daily basis and you don't really have a long table of any sort, purchase yourself one of those. It helps out tremendously when you don't have somebody else helping you hold the wood from behind. And all I'm going to do is just go ahead and start stripping this one piece of wood. This one big piece of wood here should be enough to fill around the entire window. Alright, and the same idea as before with the door. All you're doing is lining your trim up to the corners of the actual frame of the window and marking your corners. Once you have your first side cut out with the 45 degrees on each side, the top and the bottom, line it up with another piece and just copy the exact measurement so you don't have to redo it all over again. Alright, we have both sides cut out, 45 degrees on each side, on the top and the bottom. Just make sure that everything looks good, flushed up with the corners of the actual window, and that it's ready to be nailed in. Alright, so once you have your first one nailed in, all you're going to do for the second one is place it against the corners again with the window and use a level. Place the level on the bottom of the very first one that you put in, the very first piece of trim, and level it off from there. This is what's going to give you a nice, even, and leveled looking finish with the trim around the window. And once you have that leveled off or to where you want it, just go ahead and nail it in with a nail gun. I know there's a lot of little small details that need to be done with this type of project, but all these little small details really matter in the end. And you're going to do the same with the top and the bottom as we did initially with the actual door top portion, the top trim of the door. Same exact thing. You can see how flush these are without even being nailed in right now. These are flush miter cuts, and this is exactly what you want. Alright, and the structure is complete. There's more details that we're going to do later on in the future to this thing. We're going to add a deck, maybe even a porch of some sort. There's a lot of different things that we're going to do. We're going to do electricity inside, some sheetrock, some wood flooring. We're going to make this thing look pretty nice. So I want to thank you guys very much for watching the videos. If you did, you stuck with us this entire time. Please subscribe. That way you can see what we're going to do to this thing in the future. We're going to turn this thing into an awesome playhouse. But now that we actually have the structure down, we can do a lot to this thing. So again, thank you guys very, very much for watching, and again, please subscribe so that you guys can actually see what we're going to do in the future. In all honesty, one of these buildings in this condition, purchased at a store, you're looking at $3,000–$4,000. We did this thing for under $1,000 altogether to include screws, material, doors, everything that you see here, all the brackets, all the bracings. Everything was done for under $1,000. And if you purchase the material yourself, you learn how to cut it yourself, you paint it yourself, you do everything yourself. Yes, the process is a little longer than having everything pre-cut, but in the long run, you know that you did it yourself and you take a lot more pride in that, and it saves you a lot more money. So hopefully this helps you guys out somewhat in order to build your own shed if you want to. Again, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.